A police officer was patrolling a park when he decided to show off his power by picking on a man. He punched him in the face, not realizing he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Seconds later, the officer knew he had messed with the wrong person. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The afternoon sun hung high over Griffith Park, shining through the thick branches of red maple trees. The warm air carried a light breeze, making the Philadelphia heat a little more bearable. Families spread blankets on the grass, kids ran along the walking paths, and joggers moved at a steady pace, their feet tapping against the pavement. A group of teenagers sat near the playground, their laughter mixing with the sound of birds chirping. An elderly couple, probably in their late 60s, walked hand in hand, taking their time to enjoy the peaceful afternoon. Among the visitors in the park, one man sat by himself. He was on a wooden bench near a shady grove, looking completely at ease. One foot rested over the other as he watched a group of gray catbirds gather around him. His hands, rough and worn from years of work, casually tossed birdseed onto the ground. The birds eagerly fluttered and pecked at the seeds while he watched them in peaceful silence. He wore black jeans, a plain white shirt, and a leather belt with a gold buckle that had lost its shine long ago. A faded black polo cap shaded his face, casting a shadow over his strong, weathered features. His neatly trimmed beard, streaked with gray, framed a face that spoke of experience, someone who had been through a lot. Kevin Hart sat there, unmoved by the city's constant noise. He had spent his life training, fighting, teaching, and protecting. But in the quiet of the park, he had no battles to fight, no urgent tasks, just the simple act of feeding catbirds. And for now, that was enough. Then a new sound broke through the usual park noises, the heavy crunch of boots on pavement. The footsteps were slow and firm, the kind that demanded attention. They grew louder, coming closer until their owner stepped into view. Officer Andrew William was a tall, overweight man in a perfectly pressed police uniform. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the world around him, hiding the sharp, calculating eyes beneath. His utility belt was packed with all the tools of law enforcement. Handcuffs, a gun, a radio, a flashlight, all neatly arranged, polished, and ready to use. His uniform was spotless, his stance stiff, and his whole presence screamed authority. But those who had dealt with Officer William before knew there was more to him than his badge. He wasn't the kind of cop who served to help people. He liked having power, using it to control others. Kindness and patience were not in his nature. The people in this neighborhood had learned a long time ago that arguing with him only led to trouble. Most just stayed out of his way. As he walked through the park, his eyes moved over the crowds, judging them quietly. He saw the joggers, the families, the dog walkers, but then his gaze locked onto the man sitting on the bench. Something about him didn't feel right. He was too still, too calm. He wasn't a jogger catching his breath or a parent watching a child. He was just sitting there, motionless, feeding the birds. William's lips curled slightly in disgust. He had seen men like this before, stubborn types who thought they could do whatever they wanted, the kind who ignored authority, acting like the rules didn't apply to them. In William's mind, there was no good reason for someone to sit alone in the park for this long, especially a black man. If a person wasn't exercising, working, or doing something useful for society, they were just wasting space. Without a second thought, he stepped off the main path and headed toward the bench. His boots hit the ground with purpose. As he got closer, he flexed his fingers once, feeling the weight of his authority. This wouldn't take long. A few firm words, a show of power, and the old man would leave. A few people noticed William's approach. A woman walking her dog slowed down, her eyes flicking between the officer and the man on the bench. A group of young men near a picnic table exchanged looks. They had seen William in action before. They knew what happened when someone didn't follow his orders fast enough. The officer stopped right in front of the bench, his shadow falling over Kelvin. He planted his feet wide, hands on his belt, standing in a way that made his intentions clear. Kelvin didn't move. The birds kept pecking at the seeds, not bothered by the officer standing over them. A warm breeze rustled the leaves above, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and sun-baked pavement. William exhaled through his nose, irritation bubbling inside him. This was the moment when most people looked up, saw his authority, and obeyed. But the man didn't move, not even a glance. It was like he didn't even notice William standing there. That wasn't going to work. The officer shifted his weight and cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. But Kevin Hart didn't react. He didn't answer. He didn't even look up. His hand stayed steady as he dropped another handful of birdseed onto the pavement. The gray catbirds cooed and fluttered, unaware of the tension rising between the two men. Something flickered in William's mind. Not quite confusion, not quite doubt, but something close. For the first time in a long time, his presence alone wasn't enough. He wasn't used to that, and he didn't like it. He stepped forward, his polished boot stopping inches from Kelvin's foot. His hand curled into a fist, shifting slightly. He had no patience for disobedience, especially not from a black man who thought he could ignore the law. The sun kept sinking lower. Shadows stretched a little longer on the ground. Yet Kevin Hart stayed still. The air in the park had changed, though most people enjoying their afternoon didn't notice. Kids kept laughing, joggers kept moving, and the distant hum of the city beyond the trees remained the same. But around one small bench, the atmosphere felt different. Thicker, heavier, like the moments before a storm. Officer Andrew Williams stood over Kevin Hart, his presence demanding attention. The polished leather of his boots caught the sunlight. His stance was stiff with authority. He had given an order, and he expected it to be followed. That was how it always worked. But Kevin didn't move. He sat just as he was. His posture didn't change. He let another handful of birdseed fall to the ground. The catbirds didn't scatter. The bench beneath him didn't creak from any movement. If he had heard William speak, he showed no sign of it. The silence irritated the officer more than any words could have. People didn't ignore him, not when he was in uniform, not when he stood with his feet planted firmly, his voice strong. He gave orders and people obeyed. It was simple, predictable. Yet here in the middle of a public park, a black man sat as if the badge on William's chest meant nothing. William's fingers twitched at his sides. He had dealt with stubborn people before. Drunks, street punks, protesters who thought they were making a statement. But this was different. There was something unsettling about the way this man remained still. It didn't feel like defiance. It felt like he simply didn't think William was worth acknowledging. A brief flicker of doubt crossed the officer's mind, but he pushed it away. When words didn't work, actions did. With a sharp motion, William lifted his taser and struck it against the wooden bench, just inches from Kelvin's leg. The loud crack broke the afternoon calm, sending birds flapping into the air. A few people turned their heads at the sound, curious for a moment before going back to their conversations and walks. Kevin didn't flinch. William's patience wore thin. His voice cut through the air, louder this time, filled with frustration. His authority had always been enough before. The badge, the uniform, it had shaped him into someone people obeyed without question. He had spent years making sure of that, but Kevin simply reached up and adjusted his hat slightly. His face remained shadowed beneath the brim. The movement was slow, deliberate. It wasn't a sign of fear, nor was it a challenge. It was something else entirely. William clenched his jaw, his stomach twisting in a way he didn't like. He had meant to scare the man to make sure he knew who was in charge. But instead, William was the one feeling a strange, creeping doubt. This wasn't normal. Still, he wasn't about to back down. With an annoyed huff, he reached forward and grabbed Kelvin's shoulder, his grip firm and meant to show authority. The muscles under his fingers were solid, much more than he expected from a man who looked black and didn't belong. But before he could even process what was happening, his own wrist was caught in a strong grip. It wasn't rushed or violent. It was smooth, controlled, and completely effortless. William barely had time to react before the pressure on his wrist increased slightly. It wasn't enough to hurt, but it sent a clear message. A jolt of alarm shot through his chest, primal and immediate. He had faced resistance before. Some suspects ran, others fought back with wild, desperate swings. But this was different. This was the grip of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. For the first time, William's confidence wavered. He yanked his arm back, and to his relief, the older man let go. His wrist was unharmed, but he could still feel the weight of that grip, like it had burned into his skin. William took a step back and inhaled sharply. The feeling was unfamiliar. This sudden shift in control. He had been the one to start this. He had been the one to take charge. Yet, in just a few seconds, he was the one backing off. He clenched his jaw. No, he wasn't going to let a black man make him look weak. He curled his fingers into a fist and adjusted his stance, gripping it tighter. This time, there would be no warning punch against the bench. This time, he would make sure the man understood. Raising his fist, he aimed for Kelvin's face. He fully expected the man to flinch, to recoil, to accept the dominance of the law. But as his fist swung toward Kelvin, Kelvin moved. It was a small motion, almost too quick to notice. A shift of his weight, a slight turn of his upper body. But it was enough. The punch hit nothing but air, and before William could react, Kelvin's hand was on his wrist again. This time, there was no hesitation. In one smooth motion, his fist was taken from his grip, not yanked, not wrestled away, just taken. William's heart pounded. He had trained for hand-to-hand encounters. He had spent years perfecting the techniques officers use to control suspects. Yet, here, in just seconds, all his weapons might as well have been useless, as if he were a child holding a toy. Kelvin didn't yell or threaten him. He simply held the weapon, the one from William's belt, as if weighing it, as if deciding if it was even worth keeping. Then, slowly and deliberately, he let it drop to the ground. William stared at it, his breath uneven. Something between them had changed, though William couldn't quite explain how. The power he always relied on, his uniform, his weapon, his authority, was gone, stripped away by a man who had barely even moved. A few people nearby had noticed, their quiet murmurs filled with uncertainty. Two teenagers whispered to each other, their eyes darting between William and the old man. Others stood at a safe distance, watching with cautious curiosity. William's hands curled into fists. His pride burned hot, a mix of anger and something much worse. Something dangerously close to fear? He had one option left. His fingers twitched toward his holster, and Kevin Hart was already watching. Officer Andrew Williams stood frozen, his breath shallow and uneven. He could hear the growing number of onlookers, their whispers floating in the warm air like a rising tide. Some had stopped walking, their conversations fading as they turned to watch. More people gathered, drawn to the tension hanging between the two men. But William's focus was locked on the old man. The way he had taken the taser, it had been effortless, as if swatting away a speck of dust. No aggression, no struggle. And then, just as easily, he had let it drop, as if to say he had no need for such things, that they were beneath him. William's fingers twitched at his side. His whole body burned with frustration, mixed with something he refused to name. It wasn't just that he had been disarmed. It was how it had happened, how control had slipped from his grasp before he even realized what was going on. Number. He wouldn't stand for this. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the sounds of the park. His hand moved to his belt, reaching for the one thing no one could take from him. His fingers wrapped around the cool, solid grip of his service weapon. Instinct. The ultimate show of power, the final word in any standoff. And yet, as his hand tightened around the holster, something made him hesitate. This wasn't a street fight. This wasn't some thug trying to prove himself. Something was wrong. William had been a cop for almost 15 years. He had dealt with all kinds of resistance. Angry drunks, desperate criminals, men with nothing left to lose. He had been in dangerous situations, had drawn his gun more times than he wanted to remember. But this was different. The old man in front of him wasn't reacting the way people usually did. There was no fear in his eyes, no tension in his muscles, no shift in stance, no sign of preparing for a fight. Just stillness. a calm so deep it made the air feel heavy, like something unavoidable was about to happen. For the first time, William truly met the old man's gaze. They were sharp, unblinking, steady. No malice, no arrogance, no smugness. Just patience. Waiting, watching, letting William decide. A strange feeling crawled up the officer's spine, something that felt dangerously close to doubt. He had never felt like this before. His grip on the gun loosened just a little. A bead of sweat slid down his neck. The world around him seemed to shrink. The park, the trees, the people, all of it faded. There was only the heat of the sun on his face, the sound of his own breathing, and those steady eyes locked onto him. A small voice in his head, quiet but firm, whispered, "Don't do it." But pride was a dangerous thing. His fingers tightened into a fist again, and in one quick motion he threw another punch. But before it could land, something changed. The black man moved. 1 second the gun was in his hand. The next his wrist was caught in a grip like steel. There was no pain, no hard yank, no struggle, just complete control. Just like the other weapons taken from his belt, the gun slipped from his grasp. And then it was gone. His own weapon. The thing that had always made him feel in charge now rested in the rough hands of the man in front of him. William stood frozen, his hand still in the air as if his body hadn't realized it was empty. The crowd murmured. Someone gasped. A man cursed under his breath. The weight of all those eyes on him felt heavier than any punch. Kevin Hart turned the gun in his hand, checking it like he was testing its balance. His face gave nothing away. Then, just as calmly, he bent down, placed the gun on the ground beside the taser, and stood back up. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. William swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. The truth of what had just happened settled over him like thick fog. He had lost completely, and he hadn't even seen it coming. His feet felt stuck to the ground, his mind struggled to understand what had just happened, like a puzzle piece that didn't fit. He had been trained for fights. He had been trained to take control, to keep order. But this was different. This was something deeper, a kind of loss he had never faced before, and the worst part? The black man hadn't even thrown a punch. William's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Heat crawled up his neck, shame and anger twisting together in his chest. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, pressing in on him. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. Someone holding up a phone, recording. The realization hit him like a punch. This wasn't just embarrassing, this was proof. Something inside him snapped, something ugly. He had never been in this position, outmatched, outplayed, and with witnesses watching. If that video got online? No, he wouldn't let it end like this. Before he could think, his body moved. Fueled by anger, by desperation, he lunged. A final, reckless attempt to take back control. But Kevin Hart had already seen it coming. Time stretched thin between them, heavy with what was about to happen. William moved, but the choice had already been made before he even tensed his muscles. This wasn't skill or strategy, it was just blind, raw instinct. The instinct of a man drowning in his own failure, grabbing for control that no longer existed. He lunged, twisting forward in a wild, unplanned motion. His hands, empty of both weapon and power, reached for something, anything, to pull himself back from the fall he had walked into. But desperation was never a match for precision, and precision was something Kevin Hart had spent a lifetime mastering. William didn't even see what happened next, at least not in a way he could understand. One moment he was moving, and the next, everything changed. His forward motion stopped as something fast and controlled redirected him. His wrist, which had just been reaching for the old man, was caught and twisted, not with pain or force, but with a pressure so perfect that his body had no choice but to follow where it was led. His knees buckled. For a brief moment, he felt weightless. His vision tilted as the world turned sideways, and then, just as quickly, he was on the ground. There was no hard crash, no painful impact with the pavement, no injury, just smooth movement like it wasn't real. One second he was standing, and the next he was on his back, staring up at the sky. For a long time he didn't understand what had just happened. The murmurs around him grew louder, creeping in from the edges of his mind. He heard them, the voices, the gasps, the whispers of disbelief, but it all felt far away. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, and his mind tried to figure out what had just happened, but the answers wouldn't come. Then reality hit. He had been taken down effortlessly, without wasting any movement, without violence, without anger, just skill. He had lost. The shame hit him first, hot and heavy, sitting in his stomach like a weight. Then came the panic. He had lost control, and worse, people had seen it. Not just a few people, but a crowd, their numbers growing quickly. Some of them were holding up phones, their screens glinting in the sunlight. This was more than just embarrassment. This was exposure. His pulse pounded in his head as he tried to sit up, to regain even a little bit of his authority. But before he could move, a shadow fell over him. Kevin Hart stood above him, his face unreadable. There was no smugness, no gloating, not even satisfaction. He just seemed calm, like he was waiting to see what William would do next. And in that moment, William realized something that sent an even colder chill through him. The old man hadn't held back because of hesitation or luck. He had held back because he chose to. There had been no struggle, no contest of strength. Kelvin had already decided how this would end long before William had even drawn his gun. The weight of that thought was almost too much to bear. William's jaw tightened as he scrambled to his feet, frustration taking over. He knew better than to try attacking again. There was no coming back from what had just happened, but his pride wouldn't let go. He could feel the eyes on him, the judgment in their silence. He had to do something. He quickly scanned the park, looking for something to hold on to, any authority he could still use. Then, like an answer to a silent prayer, he saw two more officers making their way through the crowd. They were moving fast, hands near their holsters, their faces a mix of confusion and alertness. They had seen the commotion and were coming quickly. Relief flooded William's chest. This was his chance to take control again. He straightened his uniform, ignoring how unsteady he still felt. He turned to face them, his jaw tight, his heart racing. Before they could speak, before they could ask anything, he pointed at Kevin Hart. "He assaulted an officer," William said, his voice sharp and commanding. "I want him in cuffs now." The words were his last weapon, his final attempt to take back control and change the story before it could be taken away from him. For a moment, the approaching officers hesitated. They had seen something, maybe not everything, but enough to realize the situation wasn't as simple as William wanted it to be. Their eyes shifted between him and the old man, noticing the body language, the quiet weight of the moment. Then one of them, an older officer with gray hair at the temples and tired eyes, stopped in his tracks. Recognition flickered across his face, but it wasn't for William. It was for the man standing calmly in front of him, and in that instant his whole attitude changed. His tense posture relaxed. His hand drifted away from his holster. His gaze, still sharp, now held something else, something close to understanding. He knew who Kevin Hart was. The realization spread to the other officers too. Neither of them moved to grab their cuffs. Neither reached for their guns. They just stood there, exchanging a glance that said more than words ever could. William felt his stomach twist. Something was slipping away from him, something bigger than just control. The story he had been trying to create, the version of events he had wanted to push, was falling apart right in front of him. His hands clenched by his sides, his mind scrambling to figure out how to fix it. But then the senior officer spoke. "Andrew," he said quietly. Just the name, nothing more. But the tone in his voice, the weight of it, was enough to freeze William in place. The silence that followed felt deafening. At that moment, he knew he'd lost. Not just the fight, not just the authority he'd once had without effort, but something much bigger. As the realization sank in, surrounded by the quiet judgment of his peers, William felt his confidence shatter. Kevin Hart hadn't needed to lay a single punch. The truth had been enough. The park fell silent. The silence after the senior officer spoke wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. A new understanding seemed to settle on everyone who had gathered to watch. The tension that had filled the air just moments ago was now replaced with something else. Finality. Officer Andrew Williams stood stiff, his body frozen in the posture of a man refusing to accept what was happening, even as it unfolded around him. His mind raced, trying to find something, anything to reverse what had already slipped away. But the truth was clear. The control he had once had was gone. The senior officer stepped forward. He was older than William, his face worn from too many years on the job, his hair graying at the temples. Unlike William, his uniform wasn't perfect. It was soft with wrinkles, the sign of a man who spent more time working than worrying about how his uniform looked. He glanced from William to Kevin Hart, then back to William, his expression unreadable. William's breath was heavy, each inhale laced with frustration and the bitter taste of something he couldn't name. "You need to stop," the senior officer said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, an authority that didn't come from shouting, but from experience. William opened his mouth, the instinct to argue burning in his throat. But he had no argument, no excuse that would stand up to the weight of the truth, and worse, he knew it. A shift moved through the crowd and the watch. Their murmurs were quieter now, no longer filled with confusion, but with a growing understanding. People had seen what happened. They had watched William make things worse, tried to control a man who had never raised his voice, let alone his fists, and they saw him fail. A man in the crowd whispered something under his breath. A woman near him nodded, another held up a phone that was still recording. William swallowed hard. The senior officer let out a long breath, like he had seen this happen before. Like he had been through it too many times with men who let power make them reckless. He stared at William for a moment before speaking again. "Give me your badge." The words hit him like a punch. William's stomach twisted. His skin burned with heat. His breath caught in his chest. His whole world, his whole identity was tied to the badge on his chest. The power it gave him. Without it, he was nothing. His hands twitched at his sides. "This isn't necessary," he said, but his voice didn't have its usual strength. The senior officer's face didn't change. Badges and guns. The order was clear. There was no room to argue. A fresh wave of shame flooded through William. Slowly, stiffly, he reached for the metal pin on his chest. It feels different now. He had worn it for years, carried it like armor, thinking it made him untouchable. But it didn't protect him today. With shaky hands, he took it off and handed it to the senior officer. Then came the gun. This was even worse. He had already lost it once today, already felt the horrible humiliation of having it taken from him, like he was a child pretending to be in charge. Now he had to give it up willingly. The gun felt heavy in his hand, the weight familiar. He hesitated. The senior officer didn't move, didn't hurry him, but his meaning was clear. William had no choice. Slowly, carefully, he took out the magazine, cleared the chamber, and put the empty gun on top of his badge. As soon as it left his hands, something inside him cracked. The senior officer gave a small nod, like he knew this would happen. Without saying anything else, he turned and signaled to the younger officer beside him. "Escort him out of the park." William's jaw tightened. He wanted to fight, to resist, to hold on to what was already gone. But there was nothing left to hold. A hand touched his arm, not rough or forceful, but firm. The younger officer, one he hadn't noticed before, stood beside him, waiting for him to move. He did. The walk to the edge of the park was the longest of his life. Every step felt like a weight on his shoulders. He could hear the murmurs behind him, feel strangers' eyes following him as he left. He kept his head up, refusing to look at them, refusing to see what they saw. A once powerful man brought down to nothing. By the time he reached the street, the world felt strange. The uniform he wore no longer had the same power. Without the badge, without the gun, it was just fabric. Just another set of clothes worn by a man who had lost everything. Behind him, the park kept going. The incident was over and life was moving on without him. And in the middle of it all, Kevin Hart stood just like he had before. Unmoved, unshaken, a man who never needed power to show who he was. The crowd, which had once been unsure, now looked at him differently. Not just with respect, but with recognition for who he truly was, for what William had never been. And as the former officer disappeared from view, Kelvin, without saying a word, returned to his bench. The gray catbirds, uninterested in human matters, fluttered back to him, pecking at the seeds he scattered with the same calm patience he had shown from the beginning. It was over, and as it always had been, justice had spoken. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more. Check out our other videos for more amazing content, and be sure to share this one with your loved ones.